My name is Manuel, and I never imagined that old age would bring me the greatest pain of my life. I worked hard since I was a boy, sacrificed every drop of sweat to raise my children, and believed that in the end, they would be my support, my shelter, my rest. But I was wrong. One night, sitting in the darkness of my room with an empty stomach and a heavy heart, I realized the truth. After giving them everything I had, even my health, even my dreams, I was left alone, hungry. It wasn't just the lack of food that tortured me. It was the lack of care, the lack of love. The silence of the empty house echoed like a scream. Every shadow in the room seemed to mock me, reminding me that there was no one there to care. I remembered the lavish tables I'd prepared myself when I was younger, the sacrifices I'd made so my children would never feel what I felt that night. And ironically, there I was, the man who'd always deprived himself to feed others, now left to fend for himself, waiting for someone to remember me. Hunger aches the body, but loneliness corrodes the soul. And that night, I realized that the cruelest thing wasn't an empty stomach, but a heart shattered by ingratitude. This is my story. The story of a grandfather who gave his all and was left to rot in the darkness of indifference. I was born in a poor house in the countryside, where the floor was dirt and the wooden walls let in the cold night wind. From an early age, I learned what hunger meant. Often, before bed, my mother would share a piece of stale bread between me and my siblings, saying she had nothing left. I grew up promising myself that when I had my own family, I would never let my children feel the same emptiness in their stomachs that I felt. And I kept that promise. I worked as a bricklayer, as a truck driver, as a night watchman. It didn't matter what the job was. If there was a chance to earn enough to buy food, I was there. How many times did I return home exhausted, with swollen feet, but with a bag of rice or a piece of meat to put in the pot? The hunger that haunted me as a child would not touch my children. I swore that. When they grew up, I did everything I could to keep them from noticing the hardships I was going through. I often said I'd already eaten on the street, so there would be more food left over for them. I watched them grow up strong and healthy, never having to go to bed on an empty stomach. That was my greatest pride. But life exacts a heavy toll on those who always give without ever receiving. My body over time began to weaken. The hands that lifted bricks lost their firmness. The legs that endured double shifts lost their strength. And it was then that I needed the same care I once offered. It was then that I discovered the cruelest face of ingratitude, when those who fed on my sweat decided that I didn't even deserve a plate of food. The first sign of abandonment came subtly, almost imperceptibly. I was still living with my oldest son, who had taken over the house after my health began to fail. At first he would say, "Father, don't worry about anything. You've already done enough. Now rest." These words comforted me. I believed I would finally receive the care I'd dreamed of. But little by little, his tone changed. When I asked about dinner, he would reply, "I didn't have time to buy anything today. See if there's anything in the fridge." I opened the door and found only a scrap of old food, some empty wrappers, and a nearly dry water bottle. I grabbed a piece of hardened bread and ate slowly, trying to stave off my hunger. I didn't complain. I convinced myself it was just a bad day. But bad days turned into weeks. My daughter-in-law began cooking just for herself, her husband, and the children. I listened to the clatter of dishes, the smell of food wafting through the air, and waited for someone to call me to the table. But no one came. Often, after everyone was finished, I'd go into the kitchen and find the pan scraped clean, as if it had been washed by their own appetite. One night I gathered up my courage and asked, "Have you forgotten about me?" She looked at me coldly and replied, "You've had enough to eat in your life. You can't sustain two worlds anymore." Those words cut me like a knife. I walked back to my room in silence, my throat dry, and sat on the edge of the bed. My stomach hurt, but the greater pain was the knowledge that I was becoming invisible in my own house. There, I realized that what I feared most as a child had returned. Hunger, my old friend, had found me again. But this time it wasn't caused by the world's poverty, but by the indifference of my own family. The nights were the worst. I'd lie down with an empty stomach and listen, through the thin walls, to my grandchildren's laughter after dinner, the clinking of silverware against plates, the lively conversations at the table. And there I was, in the dark, pretending the rumbling of my own stomach didn't exist. I remember one night in particular. I was so hungry my hands were shaking. I got up slowly, went to the kitchen, and found only a plate of forgotten scraps in the sink, gnawed chicken bones and some potato peelings. Without thinking, I grabbed those peels and chewed them with tears in my eyes. It wasn't food, but it was all I had left. As I chewed, memories came flooding back. I saw before me the many times I'd worked day and night to ensure my children never went without food. I remembered selling my bicycle to buy rice, living for weeks on end on coffee and bread so they could have meat on the table. I'd braved hunger so they'd never know it. And now, ironically, they were the ones letting me taste that pain again. Only this time, it wasn't the hunger of poverty. It was the hunger of ingratitude. That hurts more. That corrodes the soul. Back in my room, I sat in the darkness. I didn't want to turn on the light. It felt like even the light had abandoned me. Hunger was doubling over inside me, but it was loneliness that crushed me. I wanted to hear a voice saying, "Father, sit at the table with us." But all he heard was the empty echo of silence. That night, I realized a cruel truth. I wasn't just starving for food. I was starving for love, for care, for dignity. The days began to drag by as if each one were an unbearable burden. My body was rapidly weakening. My legs, once steady from carrying bags of cement and heavy tools, now trembled even when getting out of bed. My stomach ached constantly, not from a lack of appetite, but from the lack of food. I drank water to stave off hunger, but even water sometimes seemed insufficient. One afternoon, I heard my daughter-in-law complain loudly in the kitchen. "This old man is nothing but an expense. He even wants the leftover food." The words echoed inside me like thunder. I, who had spent my entire life supporting that family, was now being called dead weight, a useless expense. I locked myself in my room, lay in bed, and stared at the ceiling for hours, asking myself, was all my effort in vain? Did every drop of sweat, every sleepless night, every dish I secured for them lose its value? Memories haunted me. I saw my wife again in the makeshift kitchen we had in our early years of marriage. I remembered her smiling, even when dinner was just rice and thin beans, because she knew I had given everything I had to bring that food. I remembered the sparkle in my children's eyes when they came home from school to find the table set, never imagining how much I had sacrificed to make it possible. Now that glow had faded. In its place, I found only contempt. At night, while everyone slept, the silence in the house weighed like lead. I sat up in bed, my hands trembling, and spoke in a low voice almost without strength. "Sir, I don't know if it was worth it anymore. I gave my whole life, and all I'm left with is hunger and darkness." I felt tears wet my face. I, Manuel, who had once been the foundation of the house, was now just a forgotten old man, waiting for time to consume me in the dark. That night, my hunger seemed greater than ever. My body trembled. My throat was dry, and each minute passed slowly as if time had stopped to test me. The darkness of the room wasn't just an absence of light. It was a reflection of the emptiness I felt inside. Lying down, I listened to the distant sound of the wind hitting the windows, mixed with memories that wouldn't leave me alone. I could see in my mind the faces of my children when they were little, running around the house, and I remembered how I'd strive to make sure their plates were always full. Now, ironically, I was the one alone, with an empty stomach and a heavy soul. The tears flowed slowly, and for the first time I didn't just cry from hunger. I cried from the absence of care, from the feeling of being invisible to those to whom I'd given everything. I asked myself silently, has all my effort been forgotten? Do I still have value? It was then, in the midst of the darkness, that a memory emerged like a small flame. I remembered my wife's words, spoken so often in the darkest moments. "Manuel, never forget, God is with us, even when no one else is." That sentence came like a breath to my heart. I was still weak, still hungry, but something inside me was ignited. Perhaps I had been forgotten by men, but not by God. I closed my eyes and, in a low voice, just whispered, "Lord, if I'm still here, it's because there's still a purpose. Help me find it." I fell asleep with that prayer on my lips. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something I didn't yet understand. but which was beginning to emerge even in the darkness. The next morning I woke up still weak, but with something different pulsing inside me. The words I'd whispered the night before, "Lord, help me find purpose," echoed in my mind. There was no food on the table, no hugs from children or grandchildren, but there was a spark of strength I hadn't felt in a long time. I sat up slowly on the edge of the bed, looked around, and realized if I accepted silence and hunger as my fate, it would be like letting everything I'd ever lived fade away. And I didn't want my story to be remembered only for abandonment. I wanted it to be remembered for the truth. I, Manuel, had given my all for that family, and that truth couldn't be buried in darkness. I grabbed an old notebook from a drawer and began writing. First, I described what happened in the hospital, then the days I'd been left without food, the moments I'd heard harsh words in my own home. But along with that, I also wrote down memories of the past, the late nights at work, the sacrifices, the dreams I'd given up to ensure my children's future. Each word on the paper was like a brick rebuilding the dignity they'd tried to strip away. As I wrote, something inside me was gathering momentum. I was no longer just a frail old man. I was gathering evidence from my own life. I was preparing myself so that, when the day came, no one could say I was exaggerating or making things up. Next to the notebook, I placed a small folder where I kept old documents, photos, and letters from my wife. All of this formed a portrait of my existence, my struggle, my worth. And I realized that this would be my weapon, not against them with hatred, but against the lie of oblivion. At that moment, I understood. I would not die in silence. I still had a voice. I spent that entire morning writing, scribbling, erasing, and rewriting. Each sentence in the notebook seemed to tear away a piece of the pain I'd been holding inside. The more I wrote, the more I realized my life couldn't be summed up in hunger and abandonment. My story had been made of struggle, sweat, and love. I remembered Mary, my wife, how often she said, "Manuel, what we do today isn't for us, it's for our children. They'll understand one day." I picked up one of the letters she left years ago, in which she thanked me for working 3 shifts to pay for her treatment when she was sick. I read those words with tears in my eyes. It was as if she herself were there, reminding me that I couldn't let my worth be erased by ingratitude. On the table, I organized everything. Old pay stubs, family photos in which I always appeared standing in the background, holding everything without complaint. I remembered nights when I sold my own dinner so my children could have something better on their plates. Each piece of evidence was like a silent testimony that said, "You weren't useless, you built." As I sifted through these memories, something began to form in my mind. A plan. I wasn't seeking revenge, but I wanted my children to look into my eyes and recognize who I was. I wanted them to see the man they'd forgotten in the dark, and to remember that every piece of their lives was built on my sacrifices. That night, I wrote the first of many letters. I began with my oldest son. "Son, do you remember the pair of shoes you got when you were 10? That month I worked twice as hard, slept in cold warehouses, just so you could go to school with dignity. Today, I just ask that you don't forget who did this for you." The words came out filled with pain but also with truth. I didn't yet know how or when I would deliver those letters, but I knew that one day, in front of everyone, I would speak. No longer as a silent old man in the darkness, but as a father who had given everything and now demanded to be seen. In the days that followed, I turned the silence of the house into a rehearsal. When night fell and everyone was in bed, I would sit on the edge of the bed and begin speaking softly, as if I were already in front of them. "Do you remember every meal you ate?" I said, staring into space as if they were my children. "Know that every dish you ate tasted of my sweat. You slept soundly because I stayed awake all night. You grew strong because I became weak in your place." I paused, took a deep breath and repeated until I found the firmness I wanted. I didn't want to shout. I didn't want my words to sound like revenge. I wanted them to come out clear, full of truth so there was no denying it. Besides the essays, I continued writing. Every memory that came to me was jotted down in the notebook. The time I sold my favorite tool to buy milk. The day I worked in the rain to secure my school tuition. The months I lived on stale bread to pay for my wife's treatment. It was all there, in shaky but vivid writing. Sometimes when I finished writing, I would look up at the ceiling and say to God, "Give me strength, Lord. I don't want to speak with hate, I want to speak with truth." In these prayers I felt a strange calm, as if someone were saying to me, "Write, prepare yourself, the moment will come." One day I spent hours staring at my reflection in the mirror, my tired face, my white hair, my deep wrinkles. I touched my face and said out loud, "They will see me, not just as the old man who bothers them, but as the man who gave his entire life for them." In that moment I realized that the pain was no longer just pain. It was fuel. I would no longer be a prisoner of darkness. I was preparing myself for the light of truth. Letters piled up on the table in the small living room, each one written with trembling hands but with the firmness of someone who had nothing left to lose. One was for my eldest son, another for my daughter, and another even for my grandchildren, who perhaps didn't yet understand the gravity of these things, but who would one day need to know who the grandfather was who supported them with such sacrifice. In them, I didn't hurl dry accusations. I told stories they themselves had lived, but chose to forget. Like the winter I worked carrying bags of cement in the rain just to make sure we had new blankets in the house. Or the summer I sold the only radio we had, the one I loved listening to so much, to buy school supplies. As I wrote, tears flowed. But there was also a strange peace. I realized I was reclaiming my own memory. These weren't just letters to them. They were letters to me, so that I would never forget who I was. At the bottom of the drawer, I found a hidden handkerchief, a gift from my wife for our first wedding anniversary. The fabric was worn, but it still had the following embroidered on it in small letters: "To never forget who you are." I clutched that handkerchief in my hands and felt as if Mary was still with me, encouraging me not to allow my life to be reduced to abandonment. I began to imagine the day of the confrontation. I didn't know exactly when it would happen, but I knew it would. I pictured the family gathered around the table, their voices falling silent as I opened the blue folder containing the letters and documents. I didn't want to humiliate anyone. I wanted them to face reality. And every night, in prayer, I repeated the same phrase: "Lord, prepare my heart so that when that day comes, my words will be of truth, not hate." Little by little, fear gave way to courage. I was no longer just the old man starving in the darkness. I was becoming the man who would bring the truth to light. The pages of the black notebook were almost completely filled. The letters, carefully folded, lay inside the blue folder alongside the old documents and photographs. Each object there wasn't just paper or a memento. It was part of my life, a testament to the fact that I had lived with dignity, that my story couldn't be erased by ingratitude. One night, sitting on the porch, I felt the cold wind blow on my face and realized the time for silence was ending. The pain that had once paralyzed me now transformed into a strength I never imagined I still possessed. I decided, at the next family gathering, when everyone was together, I would speak up. It wouldn't be a hushed conversation, nor a timid plea to be remembered. I would speak firmly, before everyone, looking each one in the eye, not with rancor, but with the truth of the hunger I endured, the darkness I faced, but also of the entire life I gave for them. I spent days rehearsing in front of the mirror. I held the notebook in my hands and said, "After giving you my whole life, you left me alone, starving. But today I say, I am not disposable." I repeated the words until my voice stopped trembling. I knew the tears would come, that the emotion would tear me apart, but it didn't matter. I was ready. On the last page of the notebook, I wrote a sentence that would be my shield on the day of the confrontation. "I will not speak to destroy, but so that the truth may be seen and dignity restored." I closed the folder, took a deep breath, and looked up at the starry sky. I felt in my heart that my wife, wherever she was smiling with pride. I, Manuel, the old man forgotten in the darkness, was ready to bring light. The day arrived faster than I imagined. My daughter had planned a Sunday lunch gathering with her siblings, nephews, and grandchildren. It was supposed to be an afternoon of laughter and memories, but for me, it would be the moment of truth. I woke up early, put on my best shirt, the same one I wore to my first grandson's baptism, and polished my shoes calmly as I did when I still went to work. I picked up the blue folder with the notebook and letters, held it against my chest, and closed my eyes for a moment. I took a deep breath and murmured in prayer, "Lord, do not let me speak with rancor. Let these be words of truth." When I arrived, the house was full of voices, children running around the yard, the smell of fresh food wafting from the kitchen. Everyone greeted me quickly, some with hurried kisses, others just a nod. I sat in silence, resting my briefcase on my lap, taking in every detail. Lunch began with laughter, chatter about work, and travel plans. I looked at that lavish table and remembered the nights I'd gone without so they could have just that. Unlimited food, worry-free. And with each memory, the weight of the decision grew within me. That's when I heard a loose, almost whispered phrase said by my daughter-in-law to another person. "Father is becoming increasingly quiet. It seems like he doesn't even miss anything." That was like a snap. I straightened up, placed the folder on the table, and in a firm voice said, "It's not that I don't miss it. It's just that the time has come for you to hear what I've been keeping silent for a long time." The conversation stopped immediately. Everyone looked at me surprised, some confused. I slowly opened the folder, took out the black notebook, and placed it in the center of the table. After giving my entire life to you, I ended up alone, starving in the darkness. Today, before this family, I will no longer remain silent. The silence that followed was so profound that it seemed as if even the walls were listening. The silence in the room was so thick that even the clatter of silverware stopped. The children were led out into the yard, leaving only the adults at the table, staring at me as if unsure of what to expect. I rested both hands on the black notebook and spoke slowly, so that every word would sink in. "Do you remember the lavish tables you sat at as children? The warm food waiting for you, even when I came home with my feet swollen from working so hard? Well, know this. Many times I didn't eat so you could eat. I drank only coffee, left my plate aside, but I never let anything go missing from your plates." I opened the notebook and showed a scribbled page where I had jotted down old memories. Here I wrote about the night I sold my only radio, the one I loved, to buy school supplies. You didn't know it, but that's how I ensured you went to school with dignity. I looked at my daughter, who was looking away. Here's also the winter I bought new blankets, but only after working for days without sleeping, because I couldn't bear to see you shivering in the cold. Tears began to flow, but I didn't let my voice waver. And now, after all this, do you know what I got in return? I was left alone, starving while you ate. The same man who never let you go to bed empty-handed was left in the dark, listening to the sound of silverware clanging on the other side of the wall. I picked up a yellowed photo and placed it on the table. It was me, still young, with Maria, my wife, holding you both in her arms. She always said that one day you would recognize what I did, and she hoped to live to see that day. But she died believing in that hope. I looked up and stared at each of them. Tell me now, is this what I sacrificed my life for? To end up invisible, begging for a plate of food in my own home? Shame hung heavy in the air. Some began to cry silently. Others kept their faces straight, but didn't have the courage to look me in the eye. The room was plunged into an uncomfortable silence. I could only hear the sound of the clock on the wall ticking away each second like a hammer in everyone's chest. I rested my hands on the table, took a deep breath, and let my voice come out steady, without a tremor. I want you to look me in the eye now. Don't lower your heads. Tell me, did I deserve to go hungry in my own home? After giving every bit of my life for you, did I deserve to be left in the dark, alone, as if I had no value anymore? My oldest son shifted in his seat. His eyes were red, but his mouth remained closed. My daughter clutched the napkin between her fingers until it nearly ripped. I saw my daughter-in-law look away, as if seeking escape where there was none. Make no mistake, I continued. I'm not talking about a day or two. It was weeks, it was entire nights listening to you eat dinner on the other side of the wall while I drank only water. You know that, you know. I took one of the letters from the folder and read it out loud. Son, that day you brought your friends over for dinner. I stayed in my room in silence because there was no room for me at the table. You laughed and celebrated, and I was left in the darkness with an empty stomach. I closed the letter, looked at him, and asked, Tell me, John, do you remember that day? He brought his hands to his face and murmured in a choked voice, God, Dad, I remember. And I also remember choosing to do nothing, Tears came to my eyes, but I continued. I turned to my daughter. And you, Anna? How many times have you walked past my door and not even offered me a plate of rice? She began to cry, her voice coming out in sobs. Dad, I thought you didn't care, that you were used to eating later. I was wrong. The confession hung in the air like an unbearable weight. Everyone's faces were streaked with tears or shame. Well, no, he concludes, slamming his hand on the notebook, that I will no longer remain silent. Today, in front of everyone, the truth has been told. My daughter's tears streaming down her face, my son's trembling hands covering his face, the awkward silence of the others. All of this told me that the truth had finally reached their hearts. But I knew it wasn't enough for them to simply confess. They all needed to look at me and acknowledge what they had done. I leaned on the table with difficulty and said in a firmer voice, "You need to understand that the hunger I felt wasn't just in my stomach. It was hunger for care, for dignity, for love. You left me alone, in the dark, as if I were no longer part of this family." I pulled out one of the old photos and held it up for everyone to see. In it, I was holding my small children, smiling and in clean clothes while I appeared in the background, in my sweaty work shirt. This photo sums up my life. You grew up strong, well-dressed, without ever feeling the hunger I felt as a child, because I deprived myself so that I never lacked anything. And now tell me, where was that care when it was my turn? My daughter-in-law, who had remained rigid until then, lowered her eyes and said softly, "I failed too, Manuel. Many times I had enough food and chose not to bring it to you. I'm ashamed of that." Her words fell hard and everyone felt the impact. I looked at her and replied, "Shame is the first step, but it's not enough to be ashamed in silence. We need to change." I turned to everyone and said, "I want you to never forget the image you see now. The father, the grandfather, the man who sacrificed everything, saying with tears in his eyes that he went hungry in his own home. Let this be remembered because I will not allow the lie of oblivion to bury my story." The silence was broken by a loud sob from one of my grandsons. He ran to me, hugged my legs and said, "Grandpa, I promise I'll never leave you alone again." The tears finally overflowed. I hugged that little one and felt that for the first time in a long time, someone truly saw me. My grandson's embrace was like a ray of light in that silent room. The child cried against my legs, repeating that he would never leave me alone again. And in that pure, unmasked gesture, I saw the difference between innocence and the hardened hearts of adults. I reached up and stroked her hair, then looked up at the rest of the family. My voice was firm, cutting through the air. If even a child understands the value of a hug, how is it possible that you, my own children, have left me to starve in the darkness? No one dared answer. The weight of the truth was upon everyone. I saw João, my eldest son, finally raise his teary eyes and say in a hoarse voice, "Father, I have no excuses. I failed as a son. I saw your need and chose to pretend it wasn't me." Anna, crying, shook her head. "Me too, Dad. I thought you were too strong to need help, and I used that as an excuse not to care." My daughter-in-law said nothing, but the tears streaming down her face were already a silent confession. I took a deep breath, opened the black notebook again and slammed my palm down on it. Today the lie ends. You can no longer pretend you don't know. You can no longer hide behind excuses. I was alone, starving in my own home, and that should never have happened. My voice trembled, but I didn't back down. I want you to look at me and tell me now, am I still part of this family, or am I just a burden to you? Everyone's eyes filled with tears. John stood up, walked over to me, and fell to his knees in front of the chair where I was sitting. He took my hands and said, "Father, you have always been the foundation of this family. We are the ones who have forgotten that. Forgive me." Anna joined him, crying loudly. "Dad, I promise, I will never let you be treated like you're invisible again." In that moment, everyone was exposed. The weight of the confrontation had finally fallen upon them. I didn't need to shout, nor rise in anger. The naked, painful truth was enough for each of their hearts to be ripped open before me. And there, at that climax, I realized something was about to change, not just between them and me, but within me as well. The scene from that Sunday was etched in my memory like fire. My children kneeling before me begging for forgiveness, my daughter-in-law silently weeping, my grandchildren hugging me as if afraid of losing me. All of it brought me relief but also a new burden. The awareness that human forgiveness, no matter how sincere, could not erase the deep scars that abandonment had left. That night, back home, I sat in the armchair with the black notebook on my lap. I ran my fingers through the pages filled with stories and memories and realized there was still a void inside me. Reconciliation had begun, yes, but the wound in my soul still throbbed. I closed my eyes and murmured, "Lord, I heard their apologies, I saw their tears, but it still hurts inside. How can I truly forgive without carrying this weight?" It was at that moment that a gentle memory came to me. It was Maria, my wife, saying to me on one of the most difficult days we had ever experienced, "Manuel, human love fails, but God's love never lets us fall." Her words echoed as if from heaven. There, alone in the silence of my room, I fell to my knees, my frail body trembling, and prayed the most sincere prayer of my life. "Jesus, I need you. I can no longer carry this pain alone. Teach me to forgive as you forgave me." Suddenly, the darkness of the room no longer surrounded me. I felt a gentle warmth, like an invisible embrace enveloping my entire body. I heard no voices, but a clear certainty echoed within me. You were never alone. I was with you through every night of hunger, through every tear, and now I will be with you in healing. The tears fell, but they were different. They weren't tears of pain. They were tears of relief. For the first time in years, I felt like I no longer needed to carry a grudge. There, in that prayer, I found the answer. True forgiveness would not come from the strength of my children, but from the grace of God in me. The next morning, I woke up different. My body was still weak, but inside I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in decades. I got up slowly, walked to the mirror, and, looking at myself, noticed something curious. The traces of fatigue and wrinkles were still there, but my eyes had a new glow. It was as if, after so long dulled by pain, they finally began to reflect life again. I sat at the table, opened the black notebook again, and reread some of the hardest pages, those where I'd described nights of hunger, loneliness, and contempt. Before, each line had felt like an open wound. But now, as I reread them, I realized they weren't just accounts of suffering. They were testimonies of resilience. What's more, in every painful detail, I could now see God's hand sustaining me. I remembered the night I chewed potato peels because there was nothing else to eat. Before, that memory had crushed me. But now, as I looked back, I realized that even in that humiliating situation, I hadn't died. I hadn't given up. I hadn't been destroyed. There was a greater force keeping me alive. I took the pen and wrote on the last page. It wasn't food that sustained me. It was the invisible hand of God. He was with me even in hunger, even in darkness. As I wrote, I felt a profound peace, as if the truth had finally dawned on me. I was no longer just the forgotten old man. I was a man sustained by the Creator himself. With this new perspective, I also realized that my letters and evidence weren't just meant to confront. They were meant to testify that human love may fail, but God's love never fails. I stood up and said out loud, as if speaking to the whole house, "I'm not just Manuel, the grandfather who went hungry. I'm Manuel, God's beloved son." And in that moment, I understood that my story would not end in abandonment. It would begin again in grace. That same Sunday, I decided to return to my daughter's house, where everyone had gathered during the previous confrontation. I entered slowly, carrying with me not only the blue folder, but also the certainty that something in me had changed. They welcomed me silently, still burdened by what had happened days earlier. I saw in their eyes a mixture of shame and fear that I would repeat the same accusations, that I would open more wounds. But as I sat down at the table, I put the folder aside and said calmly, "Children, you know the pain I've experienced. You know the emptiness I've felt. But today I didn't come to talk about that. Today I came to talk about what God did in me." Silence fell. Everyone looked at me, waiting. I took a deep breath and continued. I knelt before him and asked for strength. And what I found was something greater than any hurt. I found forgiveness. Jesus showed me that I didn't need to carry a grudge because he had already carried it for me. My words echoed. and I saw tears form in Anna's eyes. Juwon lowered his head, embarrassed, but I heard his heavy breathing. I continued, I didn't come to ask you to give me back the lost years, nor to make up for the pain you caused me. I came to tell you that I forgive you, not because I'm strong, but because Christ gave me the strength to do so. My daughter-in-law, who had previously avoided looking at me, was now crying silently. One of my grandsons asked softly, Grandpa, even after everything, do you still love them? I smiled with tears in my eyes and replied, I love, and I always will, because the love I have today is not just mine. It is the love that God placed within me. The previously heavy atmosphere began to change. I saw my children approach, hesitant, until Juwon placed his hand on my shoulder and said, Father, if after all this you can forgive us, then we need to learn to truly love too. And there, for the first time, I realized that forgiveness not only healed my soul but began to change their hearts as well. The tears streaming down their faces were no longer just tears of shame. They were tears of transformation. For the first time in years, I saw my children look at me not as a burden, but as the father I truly always was. Anna approached slowly, sat down next to me, and held my hand tightly. Father, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need it, she said between sobs. I shook his hand and replied, Daughter, none of us deserves God's forgiveness, but He gives it to us anyway. How could I deny you what I have received from Him? At that moment, Juwon stood up, placed his hands on the table, and spoke in a choked voice. From today on, I promise you will never again be in need. You will never eat alone again, nor live in the dark. I failed, but I want to learn to honor you while I still have time. My daughter-in-law, who had always treated me coldly, wiped away her tears and confessed in front of everyone. I was harsh, Manuel. I closed my eyes to your pain because it was easier to pretend I didn't see it. But now, I want to change. If you forgive us, give me the chance to care for you like I should have from the beginning. Those words moved me deeply. I looked around the table and realized something invisible was happening. It wasn't just human reconciliation. It was the presence of God restoring what had been broken. My grandchildren, sitting around me, hugged me tightly. One of them said softly, Grandpa, I want to have the faith you have. I smiled, and with tears in my eyes I replied, So never forget, it wasn't my strength that brought you here. It was Jesus. He is the only one who can transform hate into love and darkness into light. At that moment I realized that the true legacy I would leave my family was not material possessions, but a living faith in Christ that now reached them through my pain transformed into forgiveness. That Sunday, after so many tears, hugs, and confessions, I saw something I never thought I'd experience again. My family united not by custom, but by truth. It was no longer the heavy silence of guilt, but the sweet silence of knowing something greater was happening. I got up slowly with the help of Juwon and Anna, looked at everyone and said, You let me go hungry and live in darkness. But Christ taught me that true hunger is that of the soul, and He Himself satisfied that hunger within me. Today I no longer feel resentment, because the light of Jesus has reached me. The entire room seemed illuminated, not by the brightness of day, but by a peace neither of us could explain. It was then that I realized that my story, once marked by abandonment, was now being rewritten before everyone's eyes. I held my grandchildren's hands and said, Listen well, children. What sustains a man is not just bread, but the presence of God. Never forget that. Everyone gathered around me in a circle, and there in the middle of the room we prayed together. I thanked God not for having suffered, but because even suffering was used to bring us to this moment of reconciliation and faith. As we prayed, I felt as if Mary, my wife, was smiling down from heaven. She often said, One day, Manuel, they will see what really matters. And finally, that day had arrived. When I finished, I looked at my family and concluded, Now you know, it wasn't hunger that defeated me, nor the darkness. It was Jesus who won within me. And it is He who can transform any story, even the saddest, into a new beginning. My story found redemption because God stepped into it. But what about yours? What would you do if the pain you carry was transformed into forgiveness? Think about it. because in the next chapter I'll tell you how faith not only restored me, but completely changed my family's future.